Welcome to the deep dive. So today we're basically attempting to answer one of the most fundamental mysteries in all of biology.
We really are. It's a big one.
It is. We are looking at this recent, just fascinating paper published in the journal Cell that kind of completely upends our understanding of how the brain wires itself.
Yeah, upends is definitely the right word for it.
Right. So the mission of this deep dive today is to explore what we call the connectome, which is the comprehensive map of neural connections in your head. And we're going to look at new evidence suggesting that the brain's wiring isn't just driven by, chemical gradients or genetics.
Right.
It's actually driven by geometry. The physical shape of the brain literally dictates its wiring.
Which is a massive paradigm shift. I mean, to really grasp the gravity of what this Cell paper is proposing, you first have to appreciate the sheer, just mind-bending scale of what we are talking about here.
Oh, absolutely.
We aren't dealing with a simple circuit board. The human cortex contains over 16 billion neurons. And those neurons are linked by roughly 150,000 kilometers of axonal wires. I always
had to stop and just process that number, like 150,000 kilometers of organic wiring packed inside a single human skull.
Yeah, it's wild. It creates roughly 164 trillion individual synapses.
Trillion, with a T.
Trillion, exactly. It is, by pretty much all measurements, the most complex architectural structure we know of in the universe. And for decades, the holy grail of neuroscience has been figuring out the underlying rules that govern how that architecture builds itself.
Because it has to build itself, right?
Exactly. How does a system that complex know where to run its cables?
Okay, let's unpack this a bit.
Right.
Because usually we think of the brain as a computer wiring itself based on what we learn.
Right.
If you look at a computer motherboard, there is a literal blueprint. An engineer decided that this chip needs to connect to that memory bank, so they drew a gold trace between them. It's very top-down precision.
Right, but the brain doesn't have a tiny engineer inside.
Exactly. So are you saying it's more like an acoustic instrument wiring itself based on its shape?
I think that's actually the perfect analogy. And to understand why this matters, we have to look at how scientists previously thought the brain wired itself and why those old models were missing a pretty massive piece of the puzzle.
Okay, lay it on us. How did we used to think this worked?
Well, the prevailing theories historically treated the brain almost like a collection of separate cities on a map, right? Connected by a highway system. In network neuroscience, we talk about two main features, which are topology and topography.
Let's define those for the listener real quick, because that distinction is pretty crucial for this new model we're getting into.
Sure. So topology is all about how things connect, completely divorced from physical space. Think of a subway map you see on the wall of a train.
Like the London Underground map?
Perfect example. It tells you which station connects to which line, but it drastically distorts the actual geographic distance between those stations.
Right, they just make it look like a neat grid.
Exactly. Now, topography, on the other hand, is the actual physical embedding of that network. It's the literal GPS coordinates of those stations in the real world.
Okay, got it. Topology is the connection. Topography is the physical location.
Right. And when trying to model how those physical connections form, the reigning champion in the field was something called the exponential distance rule.
The EDR.
The EDR, yeah. And it's based on a very sound biological principle, which is wiring cost. The brain is incredibly resource hungry, but it operates under, very strict constraints.
It's basically a greedy system living in a very cramped studio apartment. It has to be highly efficient.
That's exactly it. It only has so much metabolic energy to spend, and it is physically trapped inside the limited volume of the cranium.
So it wants to save space.
Exactly. So the exponential distance rule basically states that the probability of two brain areas connecting drops off exponentially the further apart they are. The brain vastly prefers to build short, cheap wires to conserve energy and space.
Which makes intuitive sense. I mean, think about it. If you are setting up a home office, you don't run a printer cable through the ceiling, down the hall, and into the guest bedroom if you can just, plug it in right next to your desk on the floor.
Right. It's just basic efficiency. And to supplement that, scientists also leaned on a rule called homophilic attachment.
The like attracts like principle.
Yep. Brain regions that have similar cellular properties, or maybe regions that mature at the exact same time during development, they're just more likely to wire together.
Right.
And if you combine the exponential distance rule with homophilic attachment, you actually get a reasonably accurate prediction of the brain's short-range local connections.
And this is where I was getting really hooked by the source material. Those old models completely fall apart when you look at the brain's superhighways.
They do.
Because the brain has these massive network hubs, specifically in what they call the transmodal association cortices. And these are the regions responsible for our highest level cognition.
Right, the stuff that makes us human.
Exactly. Integrating sights, sounds, memories, the heavy lifting of being a person.
Which requires massive long-distance integration across totally disparate regions of the brain.
But if the brain is strictly following that exponential distance rule, like if it only cares about saving wire and metabolic energy, those long-distance hubs just shouldn't exist. I mean, they are ridiculously expensive to build and maintain.
And that is the gaping hole in the traditional graph-based models. They treat the brain as these discrete, disconnected nodes just trying to optimize a budget, and because of that, they completely fail to predict where these massive long-distance hubs will physically form.
They can't explain the topography of our highest brain function.
Exactly. They fail at predicting the topography of the most important parts of the human mind.
Let's do a quick recap here for everyone listening, just to make sure we're all on the same page before we get into the really wild stuff.
Good idea.
So, bullet point summary. The brain's wiring map, the connectome, is incredibly complex. Old models focus purely on keeping wires short to save energy, which is the EDR, and homophily, which is like attracts like. But those models totally fail to explain our complex long-distance brain hubs.
Perfect summary.
So here's a question for you, the listener, to chew on. Have you ever tried to organize your desk just to save space, only to realize you actually need your most used items connected or right next to each other, no matter how far apart they started out? How would you balance that kind of efficiency with actual function?
That's the exact problem the brain had to solve.
Okay, so if the old shortest distance between 2 points rule can't explain the brain's most crucial networks, what is the alternative? This brings us to the core of the cell paper, which introduces something called neural field theory. And this requires a pretty massive shift in how we visualize the brain.
It really does. Neural field theory, or NFT, asks us to just stop looking at the brain as a bunch of individual disconnected dots on a piece of paper.
No more subway maps.
No more subway maps. Instead, we need to view the brain as a continuous physical sheet of tissue. In this framework, brain activity isn't just a spark jumping from node A to node B. Macroscopic brain activity, basically anything happening on a scale larger than about 0.5 millimeter, it moves across this continuous tissue as a wave.
Oh, wow. So just like dropping a stone into a calm pond and watching the ripples spread out across the surface, the medium itself is continuous.
Exactly like that. And because the cortex, the outer layer of the brain, has a very specific, highly folded three-dimensional shape, those ripples don't just spread out randomly.
Because it's not a flat pond.
Right. They behave in highly specific ways governed by the geometry of the space they're traveling through.
Which introduces the absolute star mathematical concept of this paper, geometric eigenmodes.
Yes. To find these eigenmodes, the researchers used a mathematical tool called the Laplace-Beltrami operator.
That sounds incredibly intimidating.
Yeah, no, it sounds a lot worse than it is. It's essentially just a set of equations used to describe the geometry of a curved surface. When you apply this math to the highly folded 2D surface of the brain, you can calculate its natural resonances.
I think the easiest way for the listener to picture this is to just imagine a large brass bell, like a church bell.
That's a fantastic way to visualize it.
Right, because when you strike a bell, it doesn't just vibrate in a chaotic, random way. Because of the bell's specific physical shape, it vibrates in natural, predictable patterns. Some parts of the metal bend and flex wildly, while other parts of the bell actually stay perfectly still. Those natural standing waves are the eigenmodes of the bell.
Yep.
And the brain has them too.
It does. And just like the acoustics of that bell, the brain's geometric eigenmodes have specific wavelengths and frequencies, which the researchers denote with something called eigenvalues.
Okay, break that down for us.
So a low eigenvalue corresponds to a long spatial wavelength. These are massive, sweeping waves that cover wide areas of the entire brain.
Kind of like a deep bass note.
Exactly. And a high eigenvalue corresponds to short, localized, choppy waves.
Higher pitch, smaller ripples.
You got it.
And if we look closer at these standing waves, we need to understand the anatomy of the wave itself, specifically nodes and antinodes. And I want to be really clear here. In wave physics, a node is not a dot on a network map like we were talking about earlier.
Right. Totally different definition here.
A node is the quiet spot on the wave. It's the part that has zero amplitude, like the part of the bell that isn't moving at all. The antinodes are the absolute peaks and the deepest valleys, the spots with maximum vibration.
And if we pull back and look at the broader laws of physics and biology, physical systems heavily prefer to operate in resonant regimes. They actively want to find that natural vibration.
And want to find their groove.
Right. So the theory this paper puts forward is that during early development, the brain preferentially builds and strengthens its physical axonal connections between the regions that facilitate these natural resonant patterns.
Okay, I have a quick mnemonic to help the listener remember this. Think of the acronym WAVE. W-A-V-E, wiring, aligns with vibrational eigenmodes.
Oh, I like that. WAVE.
Right. The physical shape of the brain creates the waves, and the waves dictate where the wires go. If your brain is essentially a resonant acoustic instrument, it is wiring itself to play the specific music that its physical shape naturally creates.
Which brings us to the actual mathematics the researchers used to prove this theory. Because they didn't just guess, they developed what they call the Geometric Eigenmode Model, or GE.
GEM. And the paper includes the actual GM equation. Now, reading algebra on an audio show is usually a terrible idea, but the structure of this specific equation tells such a brilliant story.
It really does. It's basically a fraction used to calculate how strong a connection should be between two different physical locations on the brain.
Okay, so let's break down the two parts of that fraction conceptually. We don't need the exact variables. Let's start with the top half, the numerator.
So the numerator is entirely focused on wave amplitudes. It takes the amplitude of the wave at location A and multiplies it by the amplitude at location B.
Wait, why multiply them together?
Because the algorithm is actively searching for areas that are in phase, it wants to find regions that are peaking or dipping at the exact same time.
Ah, okay. Picture two kids jumping on a large trampoline. If they time their jumps perfectly, like if they're exactly in phase, both hitting the bottom of the trampoline mat at the exact same millisecond, they bounce significantly higher with way less effort.
That's a great visual.
So the math here is looking for two physical spots on the brain that naturally bounce together at the wave's antinodes. The brain wants to wire those highly synchronized in-phase spots together.
Exactly. It's hunting for those trampoline partners. And then we have the bottom half of the fraction, the denominator. This part represents the energetic cost we talked about earlier.
The efficiency part.
Right. Remember those eigenvalues? They sit in the bottom of the fraction. Because of how the math works, wave modes with small eigenvalues, meaning the long, sweeping global waves, result in a much stronger overall connection weight.
So the model is heavily favoring long wavelength modes.
Heavily, because a massive brain-wide sweeping wave actually takes significantly less metabolic energy to excite and maintain than thousands of short, choppy, localized waves.
That is wild. So if we step back from the math, what is the biological motivation here? Like if we connect this to the bigger picture, why does the brain want to wire these in-phase regions together so badly?
It comes down to efficiency and stability. Connecting two regions that naturally fluctuate in phase acts as a highly efficient communication channel.
Right.
It dramatically lowers the energetic threshold needed to spark brain-wide patterns of activity. By running physical wires between these specific resonant antinodes, the brain is essentially stabilizing its own preferred dynamics. Form follows function, sure, but here, function is perfectly following physical form.
It's just wild to think about.
It really is.
Let's take a quick pause for our 10-minute recap. We've covered a ton of ground.
Let's do it.
Okay, bullet points. The new GM model predicts connections based on brain regions being in phase on a brainwave. It heavily favors large global waves because they take less energy to maintain.
Spot on.
So here's a question for you listening. Think about the people you communicate with most easily in your daily life. Isn't it usually the people who are naturally on your same wavelength? Quite literally, the physical tissue in your head is searching for other tissue on its exact same wavelength to build a bridge.
It is such an elegant theory, but, a mathematical model is just a hypothesis until you stress test it against reality. The researchers needed empirical data.
And they brought a mountain of it, didn't they?
They really did. They used diffusion MRI data from 339 human subjects.
So this is where the paper shifts from theoretical physics into hard anatomy.
Exactly. They mapped out the human connectome at two totally different scales to make sure the model worked universally.
Right, because you want to make sure it's not a fluke at a certain resolution.
Right. First, they built a massive high-resolution map at what they call the vertex level. This was tracking over 4,300 individual points across the cortex. Then, they zoomed out and made an atlas-based map, dividing the brain into 150 larger parcellated regions.
And to see if the GM was actually revolutionary, they basically forced it to compete in a cage match against a gauntlet of standard benchmarks.
Yeah, they really put it to the test. They tested its predictive power against the old exponential distance rule. They tested it against a purely random model.
As a baseline control, sure.
Right. They tested it against a model that only looked at the raw geometry without the wave dynamics, just the shape, no waves.
The LBO model.
Yes. And for the macroscopic map, they tested it against the matching index, which up until now was widely considered the absolute state-of-the-art generative model in network neuroscience.
And the results. The GEM completely dominated. It didn't just win, it crushed the benchmarks.
It really did. It accurately reproduced the rank ordering of the edge weights, which basically means it successfully predicted which physical connections would be the strongest and which would be the weakest.
And most crucially, returning to our earlier problem, the GEM successfully captured the spatial topography of the network hubs.
That was the big one.
Right. Where the exponential distance rule completely failed to explain those long-distance superhighways in the association cortices, the Geometric Eigenmode Model predicted them beautifully.
Which proves that you don't need a magical, complex set of local rules to build a hub. You just need to follow the natural resonance of the brain's physical shape.
I also really want to highlight their methodology here because in an era where, scientific replication can be a real issue, their approach was bulletproof. They used split-half cross-validation.
Right, that's crucial. Walk us through why that's so important for the listener.
Well, when you have a complex mathematical model, there's a massive danger of overfitting.
Right.
That's when your algorithm essentially hallucinates a perfect fit by memorizing the specific quirks and noise of your particular data set, rather than finding a universal truth.
It basically memorizes the test answers instead of learning the subject.
Exactly. So to prevent this, the researchers optimized the GM parameters on 1/2 of the 339 human scans. Then they locked those parameters in and tested them on the other half of the scans data the model had literally never seen before.
And it held up flawlessly. The GEM generalized perfectly across both halves, proving it was capturing a fundamental biological rule, not just a statistical artifact.
Okay, but this raises a massive philosophical question, and I have to ask it. If the physical geometry of our brain dictates exactly where the wires go, are we just biological machines? Is our entire mental architecture purely deterministic, just a total slave to the exact physical shape of our skull?
That's the existential dread kicking in, isn't it? But it's important not to fall into absolute determinism here. This geometric wiring rule is a fundamental architectural constraint.
Okay, so it's a boundary, not a script.
Exactly. Think of it as the foundational scaffolding. But it is not the only rule. We still have experience-dependent plasticity. Learning, memory, trauma, environmental stimuli, all of these things actively fine-tune the network throughout your life.
So to use our earlier analogy, the physical geometry lays down the concrete for the highway system, but your lived experience dictates the actual traffic patterns.
That's a perfect way to put it.
So question for the audience. Does knowing that your brain's physical geometry strictly dictates its base wiring make you feel more like a biological machine or an elegantly tuned instrument? Because frankly, I'm leaning toward the instrument.
Me too. And what totally blew my mind was the next phase of the study. Because showing this works in humans is one thing, but they wanted to know if this was just a quirky byproduct of the highly wrinkled human cortex, or if it was a deeper evolutionary truth.
Right, so they turned to the animal kingdom. They applied the GM model to mice, marmosets, macaques, and chimpanzees.
They did. And they didn't just rely on MRI for these animals, right? The data they used was much more precise.
And considerably more precise. Diffusion MRI, which we have to use on living humans, is non-invasive, but it has limits in its resolution. It's inferring pathways based on water molecule movement.
Right. It's basically a highly educated guess of where the wires are.
Exactly. But for the non-human models, they had access to invasive viral track tracing data. This is where you literally inject a fluorescent viral tracer directly into the animal's living brain, wait for the virus to travel down the neural pathways, and then map the exact physical route of the axons under a microscope.
It is the absolute gold standard of anatomical evidence. You are looking at the literal wires, not just a scan of them.
And incredibly, the GEM worked across all of them, which is profound when you think about the timeline here. These species represent 90 million years of mammalian evolution.
90 million years.
And their brains look wildly different from one another. I mean, if you look at a mouse brain, it is perfectly smooth, like a little jelly bean. A human brain is a dense, tangled mess of folds and wrinkles.
Right, they look like completely different organs.
Yet the underlying physics driving the wiring remain exactly the same.
What's truly elegant is how the mathematical model naturally adapts to these physical differences. In the GM equation, there is a spatial scale parameter. It essentially measures how far a wave naturally ripples out through the tissue before it loses its energy.
Okay.
The researchers found that this spatial scale parameter perfectly scales with the total brain volume across the different species.
Oh, wow. So the physical rule's identical. The math just scales up or down to match the size of the instrument.
Exactly. The acoustics of a massive cello follow the exact same laws of physics as a tiny violin. The wavelengths just scale to the physical cavity.
90 million years of evolutionary history. It suggests that long before the mammalian brain ever evolved the capacity for language or abstract art or, existential dread, its foundational architecture was already being governed by basic acoustic and geometric physics.
It's a sobering timeline. The hardware was optimized by resonance long before the software of higher consciousness was installed.
So, audience, think about this. If the fundamental rules of brain wiring are identical in you and a mouse, what do you think truly separates human consciousness from animal intelligence? Is it just the size of the violin?
That's a great question. But, this research didn't just span millions of years of evolution. It also zoomed all the way in to the highly personal level of the individual human being.
Oh, right. The shape DNA finding. This was fascinating.
So cool.
The researchers took the specific, unique geometric mesh of 100 individual human brains, because no two brains are folded exactly the same way, and they ran the GM using each person's unique eigenmodes.
Right. They wanted to see if an individual's specific personal brain shape could predict their specific wiring connectome better than using a generic group average brain shape.
And it did.
Yeah.
Your unique physical brain shape is a literal blueprint for your unique wiring. You have a personalized geometric fingerprint that dictates your neural network.
But, as with any paradigm-shifting scientific model, we do have to look closely at what it cannot do. The authors of the paper are very transparent about the rule breakers in this system.
Right, because if geometry explained 100% of the brain, things would be a little too simple.
A little too neat and tidy. First, the current iteration of the GEM is only looking at intrahemispheric connections, meaning the wiring within one single side of the brain.
Okay, so it's not looking at the corpus callosum crossing over.
Right. But the much more significant limitation is that the model entirely ignores subcortical structures. It only maps the surface cortex.
And you cannot talk about the cortex without talking about what lies beneath it, specifically the thalamus.
Yes. The thalamus sits deep in the center of the brain, and it acts as this massive relay station. It projects millions of connections upward into the cortex.
And the researchers noted that these thalamic inputs act as a major perturbation to the intrinsic geometric rules. I love this exception. It's like the geometry builds the pristine, mathematically perfect highway system based on the laws of physics, but then the thalamus comes in like a rebellious city planner.
A rebellious city planner, yes.
It forces a bunch of new off-ramps and detours that don't make geometric sense, but they are required for the brain to actually function and process sensory input.
Right. The surface geometry explains the vast majority of the variance in the wiring, but those deep, ancient subcortical structures introduce functional complexities that a purely geometric model simply cannot account for on its own.
Which I think is just a beautiful compromise between physics and biology.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, let's do our final 15-minute recap before we wrap this up.
That's good.
Bullet points: this geometric wiring rule has been conserved for 90 million years across mammals. Your unique brain shape creates a unique wiring fingerprint just for you. And deep brain structures like the thalamus act as important rule breakers to this geometric law. And audience, if variations in your brain's geometry change your wiring, how might physical changes to the brain over a lifetime alter the way you think and feel?
Synthesizing everything we've looked at today really requires a shift in perspective. For a long time, the field viewed the brain's wiring as a frantic attempt to just save space, or perhaps as a blank circuit board passively waiting for complex genetic instructions to tell every single wire where to go.
Right.
What this Cell paper reveals is that the brain is a physical medium, and it is heavily constrained by the most fundamental laws of physics and geometry.
It is operating as a resonant instrument.
Yeah.
It is naturally wiring itself to support the standing waves dictated by its own specific physical shape.
Exactly. By seeking out those in-phase antinodes, the brain lowers its energetic costs and creates a highly stable, highly efficient network capable of integrating the complex information required for consciousness. And it's a mechanism so reliable, evolution has preserved it for 90 million years.
I find that unbelievably poetic. At our core, the most complex object in the known universe, the human mind, is governed by the exact same wave mechanics that govern the vibration of a violin string, the ringing of a bell, and the rolling waves of the ocean. It connects our internal biology to the fundamental physics of the external universe in a very tangible, mathematical way.
It really does. And from a clinical standpoint, it opens up entirely new avenues for understanding neurological development. If geometry is the baseline for wiring, then analyzing the physical shape of the brain might give us unprecedented insights into neurodevelopmental conditions long before complex behavioral symptoms emerge.
Which leaves you with this final, provocative thought to mull over. If our brain's physical geometry dictates its wiring, and its wiring dictates our thoughts, our consciousness, and our very identity, what happens when that brain geometry is slightly altered during early development? Whether from physical trauma, environmental factors, or just natural cranial shape differences as an infant. Could the literal physical shape of a child's head subtly alter the music of their future mind? Think about that the next time you look in the mirror and realize you are looking at a masterfully tuned instrument. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. See you next time.